You're listening to Secrets for Scaling, a Gecko Board podcast that explores the growth secrets of successful founders and CEOs. Whether you're just launching your business or taking your company to the next level, you'll learn proven strategies and tactics for growing a sustainable business. In this episode, we talked to Patrick Campbell, co-founder and CEO of Price Intelligently, pricing software for SaaS companies. To kick things off, can you tell us a little bit about Price Intelligently and how you guys got started?
Yeah, absolutely. So my background is in econometrics and math. So I, went and I right out of school, I went and worked for the intelligence community in DC for a little while. And then I went and worked at Google, and at both places, the rules were a bit different, but they all kind of centered around this concept of value modeling, which is just kind of a jargony term for using data and different types of statistical models to get different types of output. So whether it's, hunting terrorists or hunting money, you use very, very similar methodologies. And so from there, I went and worked at a local startup that had a particularly tough pricing problem, and I got kind of thrown into working on it. And it was one of those things where all of a sudden I, really had that moment. And I think it was much clearer in hindsight than it was necessarily at the time. But, the big kind of aha was discovering that it was, all of a sudden little pricing changes would result in massive revenue gains or massive revenue losses. And so what we ended up doing is, really kind of digging in on pricing. And then when I started kind of researching a little bit more, discovered that, as product people, we put so much effort, so much time, so much love, blood, sweat, and tears, however you want to define it, into creating awesome products. And then when it comes to actually putting a value label on that, your price, we're really, really bad. We just kind of go, oh, let's just put it at this price point and see what happens, even though we put so much time into actually producing that product. And so we wanted to find a better way. And that's kind of the inception of Price Intelligently. And there's plenty to kind of talk through the trajectory, but that's how we got started. And, we're completely bootstrapped here in Boston. We're about 30 people now, and we're about 4.5 years old.
Wow, that's great. When talking about finding a better way, where did that come from? Where did that start?
Yeah, I think it was, what was kind of fortunate or unfortunate, depending on how you look at it, is that people are just, and still are, so bad at determining their value, their personal value, their product's value, et cetera, that we didn't necessarily need to produce some sort of rocket science-y way to solve this. We did produce some pretty heavy statistical models, but basically what we ended up doing is we created, based on a couple of models that I had worked on in the past, a way that based on survey data, so we could collect, survey answers from, let's say, 100 people who are in your target customer base, and based on that data, basically give you what's called your price elasticity, which is a measure of, if you move your price point, what's the relative loss or gain you're going to have in sales. And so we built that software product and we started selling it just as a regular software product. But then we quickly discovered that people just wanted us to do it for them, because pricing data isn't something that naturally comes, naturally to them. And so we started basically what's, essentially a tech-enabled service to help them with their pricing. So that's kind of the start. And now it's kind of ballooned into, more comprehensive software and, a bunch of other fun stuff as well.
Gotcha. And you mentioned that you bootstrapped, which I feel isn't all that common anymore. How did you get started in that area?
I think, what's funny is I think I'd love to say like we were very, very, targeted with the why we were bootstrapping. And I think to a certain extent we were, but it was more around, we could have raised money out of the gate. We had some really, really good conversations that would have turned into raising capital. But I think we found that we didn't really know exactly what we were going to do with the money. Obviously we could have come up with rationalization of, hey, we're going to spend the money here, we're going to spend the money there. But at the end of the day, it was one of those things where we weren't completely cognizant of where we would use that cash. And so it would have just been raising money for raising money's sake. And we had a little bit of personal runway. And so it was one of those things where we were like, all right, well, let's give it X amount of months. And if we can't figure it out, then we either shut things down or we go and try and figure out, where we can, raise some cash. And fortunately, within that 6 months, we started getting contract values high enough that, it wasn't easy at all, but we were able to, definitely start to, pay rent and pay ourselves a little bit and stuff like that. And so I think for us, it was more just a circumstance of, our customers. And now we've become a little bit more entrenched in like bootstrapping because we're in a market that I would argue we could definitely, justify X number of valuations or target market, but it's a little bit, doesn't fit the perfect, VC model. And so it's one of those things where we can kind of grow on our own terms. But, it's kind of interesting as we, money, just like any piece of software, is a tool for your business, right? And so, we're kind of in a good position where if we do want to raise money, we can definitely go out and raise, at a much better valuation, much better terms than, obviously we would have in those first 6 months.
So how does growing on your own terms impact both the team and the future of the company?
Yeah, I think... ironically, we're able to take some bigger bets. And so what's interesting about it is I think this is, not to toot my own horn or anything, I think this is very founder driven where, I don't have a wife, I don't have kids, I don't have like a mortgage, I don't have like intense expenses or, urgency, if that makes sense, in the sense of like, I need to be making a good amount of money right now. And so it gave us a lot of patience. But it also gave us the ability to really focus in on, taking some bigger bets. And so around 2 years ago, we realized that the Price Intelligently software product, although it could grow, we needed to get a little bit more touchless software. We needed to get a little bit more extra time to value. And so we came out with this product called ProfitWell. And I don't think we would have done that if we were venture funded, even though we might have had the money to do it, but we might have realized like, hey, let's just keep going after this particular market. And so being bootstrapped allowed us to kind of take that risk because we knew we could, and also that we could be a little bit more patient where we didn't need to show gains or growth immediately. And we could be, basically get some better momentum and play for the long term versus the short term. I will say that I think that it also was a detriment. So I want to, talk to the other side of the coin as well, because there's always trade-offs, because I think the Price Intelligently product, we probably didn't develop it as quickly as we could because we were focused on the cash flow of the business. And so it needed some big improvements that we weren't making. And there's still some, it's not quite technical debt, but there's still some debt we're paying on not making those improvements. And fortunately, we're in a position now where we can kind of improve everything and we have, enough people to take care of things. But yeah, there's always two sides to the bootstrapping coin. And I think a lot of people focus a little too much on one side versus the other. And I think it's a little bit more of a circumstantial type of decision.
So you're at 30 people now. How are you growing in terms of revenue, if you don't mind sharing?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to do about 5 million this year. We've been growing at, we're basically doubling every year, or more than doubling actually this year, just in terms of our revenue. And I think it's finally, now that we're at that level, it's finally getting to doubling is cannot be as easy as it has been. And I don't think this year it's been easy, but it's one of those things where, we've been growing pretty quickly, which has been a very blessed and fortunate thing.
So when you say it hasn't been easy, what are some of the challenges you faced?
I think the most immediate challenge that I think a lot of people don't think about when they're starting a company, or even if they've raised money and quickly, developing their company, is that, right now we're hitting what I'm starting to call the 25, 30 person wall, which is, and you start to feel this maybe around 20 people, but you don't really absolutely feel it until the 25, 30 mark, where everyone, isn't necessarily 1 degree connected to you anymore. It's not like I can sit down with, someone in a team that I don't work with and have a conversation with them about something that they're confused on, or if they don't necessarily see their connection to the vision, it's not something where that time is available. And so the biggest issue that we're running into right now that I have all my hands on deck essentially for is this whole concept of alignment, making sure it's crystal clear. The vision is crystal clear. It's crystal clear clear like how everyone's team contributes to that particular vision, and then ultimately making sure it's crystal clear how each person themselves, their goals, their aspirations, etc., contributes to that greater vision. And I think that I don't know if that would have been helped by money or not, but I think that's a huge issue in terms of growth that we're like running right into right now. And to be frank, it was kind of like running right into a brick wall. I think that it hits you like a ton of bricks in the sense that you might have like a feeling, hey, I need to fix this. But all of a sudden what happens is when you realize you need to fix it, and I've listened to the story multiple times from other people, like you realize that you should have fixed it 10 people ago. And so, a lot of those problems compound. And so it's just one of those things where, getting that alignment. And I think, other issues that kind of, all manifest themselves from that root cause are things like, hiring. I mean, getting the right people for the right role, keeping them happy, and making sure that ultimately they are that right person is so much more difficult than I think I ever would have expected. I think a lot of people, when they're earlier on, or maybe this was just me independently, in my own hubris or arrogance, think, oh yeah, like getting the right people, that won't be too difficult. We'll just throw some job postings up and stuff like that. But getting a group of people, especially once you reach that 30 mark and get even bigger, that can all rally around the same goal is just super complicated. And I think it's one of those things where people really underestimate the complication. And then there's always like the classic, like other problems, growing a little too quickly because we don't have our support set up correctly, or, our sales team is closing the wrong deals, or, all kinds of stuff like that. But those stories I think have been told plenty of times, so I'll spare you guys that one.
So have you found any solutions when it comes to hiring the right people?
Yeah, I think it's like super, like there's some consistent things I think across companies, and those things are like, just making sure that everyone's clear on what their job description is. I think that's a big thing, because you can hire the right person and they turn into the wrong person because the job description wasn't clear. I think some other things is we put everyone, and I don't know if this is going to scale indefinitely, but we put everyone through what we call a challenge, which is something where, and it's not meant to be a super intensive project, but if they're an engineer, they'll work on a feature, or they'll do like a contracting project. If they're a salesperson, they'll come in and do a pitch. If they're someone on our pricing team, they'll based on some data put together a pricing page. And so it's a little challenge, and if they're not any of those things, typically then it turns into, hey, what do you think your first 6 months looks like based on the problems that you've seen? And I think that really helps really helps kind of put things into perspective, and you see how people think. I know other people who have used this pretty effectively. Mark at TaxJar, he's a CEO over there. He actually has people, and they can do this because they're fully remote and they hire certain types of people, but he actually has people work for 2 weeks full time with the team before they get an official job offer. And I think they're still small, but they want to keep their company small. And so it's one of those things where, they have the luxury of doing that. But there's other things that people do. I think some other things that we found is really understanding what the leading indicators of a good hire versus a bad hire are. And our biggest thing that we found, and we're still trying to figure out how to test for it exactly, is like someone who's very mission-based. So, if I offered you 50% more money to go work somewhere that wasn't really aligned with exactly what you wanted to do, making sure that person isn't going to go take that money and just be a mercenary, as we call it internally. And so those are the big things. And I think the third thing I would say is like being completely transparent with someone during the hiring process, because if you're completely transparent with them about all the problems that you're facing, with all the, what the mission is, what everything is, what the financials are, you give them the opportunity to bow out as well. And you want to make sure that they know exactly what's going on before they jump out.
Well, switching gears a bit, Price Intelligently focuses on SaaS because your team can focus on better understanding and empowering your customers. What are some of the biggest challenges you've seen other SaaS businesses face?
Yeah, I think, if we dig into like pricing a little bit, I think that some of the bigger challenges that a lot of people have is that they don't really know their buyers. it's amazing how many companies you can walk into and say, like, who are you selling to? And, obviously, everyone has a general idea, right? Like, oh, we sell to salespeople, we sell to developers, we sell to, product teams, et cetera. But it's amazing how many companies you walk into and you say, okay, so you sell to salespeople. What kind of salespeople? And that's the end of the ability to give an answer. And what we typically look for and we want companies to know is really, and this kind of ties back to, companies that we've seen be really successful versus companies that aren't, they need to know like willingness to pay for those customers, what features they like, what features they don't like, all these different like quantified pieces. And, we have the data that actually shows that if you're, if your buyers, typically, you're growing at a much higher rate, if not, surviving at a much higher rate. And I think the other thing that kind of dovetails into that is just this acquisition brute force growth mode that a lot of people, run into within their companies. Like, at the end of the day, like channels are ephemeral, right? Like you and I were talking about how like, blogging has diminishing returns at some point. You can't, blog more and all of a sudden get more revenue. So it's one of those things where you have to find different channels. And I think a lot of people, they just try to like pound one channel down, their customers' throats essentially, and that's how they grow. And they don't look at things like their retention. They don't look at things like their pricing in order to grow. And more often than not, those companies that tend to have, this lack of buyer knowledge, they tend to just be growing through acquisition, which, is pretty painful when you think about, their companies heading out the door and things like that.
Yeah, it's almost like customer data drives empathy for your customers. And if you're not paying attention to that data, you're not really empathizing with your customers.
Yeah, I'm going to steal that because I think that's a better way to say what I just said. Yeah. But I think you're exactly right. Like, we now, and this is part of scaling, we now are putting together like a slide. It's like one slide, and that slide is basically like, here's who we build for, here's who we sell to, et cetera. So it's just like, here, like when we're having this product conversation or we're having this marketing conversation or sales or services or whatever the conversation is, like it's all centered around that buyer, and we've quantified our buyer in a way that we know, like, hey, we know that someone, that feature that we want to build or that UX that we want to put together, it's built for, a company that's not in our target, right? And we need to focus on our target, and eventually we can, reevaluate our target. But I think it's that empathy. You're exactly right that data actually breeds empathy for who those buyers are, and therefore will create some better feedback loops for them.
Would you find that it's pretty common for companies to, or who they think their customer is and who it really is, changes often in the early days? Or do you think that doesn't happen till later?
I think sadly it changes later, but in reality it should change earlier on. Like I can tell you, like I can name, it's more than I have like fingers for in terms of like data points. Like I can give you dozens of companies where they're serving customers that aren't affordable in terms of their customer acquisition costs, aren't even affordable in terms of the amount of costs like just to serve them are. And, it's one of those things where they just keep throwing money at that particular customer channel and just try to keep acquiring those customers because they don't know, like they don't even know their unit economics broken down by customer. So there's a company, like I obviously can't get into specifics, but the anecdote is they had a platform where their customers were making money on their platform. So we'll just kind of leave it mildly there. And what they discovered is they had customers who were making, let's say, $1 million a year on their platform, which is amazing, right? But the issue is that they were charging them, let's say under $50 a month. And that just right there is a little bit of a disconnect in terms of value. So someone making $1 million a year and you're charging them the equivalent of just under $600 a year. But even gets worse, those customers were costing them between $1,000 and $1,500 a month. So like if you really think about that, that's shocking. And it took them 10 years to get the data and actually look at this because they were just growing so quickly to realize how big of a problem that was, where these customers were making $1 million a year, costing them, $12,000 or more per year. And then they were only making $600 or less on those customers. And it's not rocket science, right? Like that's simple math, but they just didn't have that data and they didn't focus enough on the customer to realize what was happening.
What do you think the trick is to changing that mindset?
I think it's like founder focus. I mean, I don't think it's hubris, although hubris I think definitely like lends itself to this. Like, and I don't think you can just ultimately be a robot and just ultimately just defer to data. And so I think it's a combination of like, you get excited and you get hooked on the wrong type of growth, right? Like you look at acquisition, the number of customers that you have, the number of accounts that you have activating, like that's growth to you. And I think that at the end of the day, you need to realize that, the data will tell you like who the best customers are, who your worst customers are. And oftentimes it just takes a difference of thinking where you have to understand exactly what your goals are, what you're trying to optimize. Because if you're optimizing revenue, that doesn't necessarily mean, you're optimizing more customer accounts, more logos. That means you need to make sure that, yes, you are getting more logos. Obviously, that's going to be a big traction metric for you, but ultimately that you're making a lot of money per logo, like as they come in. So you're pricing, and then also that you're retaining those logos over time. So it's kind of like a trifecta here where I think most people, and, I don't want to make a blanket statement, but I would say like companies that are heavily venture backed, they do focus just on logos. And some companies like an Uber or Lyft, you do need to focus on customer counts because, it might be a winner take all or two winners take all type market. But most B2B SaaS companies out there, it's not winner take all. Like if you look at Gecko Board, like, yes, it would be great if every company on the planet had Gecko Board installed and was using it. But in reality, there's so many different types of BI software that not everyone is going to be a good customer. And so it's one of those things where, understanding what that ultimate goal is so that you can target the right type of customers and then align your pricing and packaging. And I think if I had to, give you a directly answer to your question, I think it really comes around like understanding exactly what your goals are and then understanding what those inputs are and then doing the customer research to kind of align those inputs and those goals to the customers that you're targeting.
Going back to the pricing thing, of course, there's no one-size-fits-all approach to pricing, but are there any fundamentals for SaaS companies that they should be following?
Yeah, there's a lot of fun stuff, and I would say like the three fundamental things, and they're not rocket science. They're super straightforward, but like people, you can only take the horse to the water. You can't, force them to drink, as they say. Know your buyers, and you don't need to boil the ocean, as they say. I'm using a lot of water metaphors for some reason, but you don't need to go crazy on your buyers, but you should know who your buyers are and you should target them. And using whatever framework we've suggested a ton of frameworks. We've open sourced the frameworks, and so that's one that you can use. I think the second piece is making sure that you have data to support the decisions that you are making. So what I mean by that is like having some data, even if it's strictly qualitative on like, hey, we're going to be $100 product versus $1,000 product, or hey, we're going to be a product that sells this versus that, like those types of things. Like the worst thing I see is people like, again, they work so hard on this product that has some sort of value and they go into a room with each other and they're like, how should we price it? And it's devoid of any customer input, any data. And then they come out and they just try to like A/B test their way to success, which is not the right way to do things when it comes to pricing. For a multitude of reasons, and the base one being a lot of times you don't have enough traffic or enough completes to really justify a full A/B test on different all the pieces of pricing. And probably the last piece that is the most tactical in terms of pricing strategy is really use what's called a value metric for your pricing. And I'm starting to really talk about this more and more because we're starting to live in a world where, value metric based pricing, meaning charging per user, per visit, per data integration, per something, per video, is becoming more prevalent. And it's also something that really bakes your way from, not having expansionary revenue, because obviously if someone grows, meaning they need more users, more data inputs, whatever, they're going to automatically upgrade. And I think because of what we're seeing in the value of features and the relative value of just features is going down in general because software is getting easier and easier to build, all of a sudden it means that we need to focus a lot more on this value metric based pricing, like actually tying your price to whatever that value is that you're creating.
You mean as opposed to just charging monthly for everything, right?
Yeah, or as opposed to like, here's plan A, plan B, plan C, and the only difference between those three plans is plan B has a little bit more features than plan A, and plan C has all the features, right? Like that type of pricing is going kind of the way of the dodo bird or, dinosaurs, where because people, like, it's horrible for upgrading, people don't see the value in it, etc. It's one of those things that if you're not doing value metric based pricing, you're probably leaving a ton of cash on the table. And it's not to say that, putting an extra feature in that plan C or putting an extra feature in that plan B than plan A is not going to work. But it is to say that if that's the primary measure of how someone upgrades or downgrades for your product, you're going to end up losing in the end.
Sounds like value metric pricing also just leads to a world with better products.
Yeah, 100%. And I think what's kind of cool about it too is that you get, you not only get better products, but you get like, how do I put it? You get better, just better relationships, right, with your customers, because, I've seen it so many times on like pure value metric based pricing. When someone gets to that next tier, it's like, it's more of like, hey, you're growing, you're using the product more, you're getting a ton of value out of it. Now we're going to charge you for that extra value. And customers are like, yeah, okay, that makes sense. We're using the product more. And it's just a much better relationship with everyone.
So for the founders who might get overwhelmed by customer feedback or the idea of gathering data in the early days, what would your tips be for them to just get started?
Yeah, I think like having some sort of customer development framework is like the first step, and like it doesn't need to be super complicated. I think like it's amazing. We've collected the data. I think it's like something like 70-80% of companies, and this includes small companies, big companies, public companies, et cetera, are talking to less than 10 people in a customer development capacity a month. And that should be shocking to you, because that means that like they're building product or doing marketing or doing a bunch of different things with like very, very little customer input. So I would say the first step is just like put a number on the whiteboard. Give someone like the designation that 20% of their job is for customer research, and then basically like put them on the plan of like, you need to make sure you're talking to 10 people a month or however many people a month in a non-sales capacity to learn more about what they want, what they need, what they don't like, what they like, etc. That's like step zero. Like that's what you can start with. And then there's a lot of frameworks out there. People have talked about a ton of different ways to kind of collect this data. And ultimately, I think it's one of those things that, it can be very, very complicated, but it can start very, very simple. And all of a sudden answers will get more questions, and then you'll go and like try to solve more questions. And then all of a sudden you'll be like, hey, I need a better methodology to solve this question. And then you'll start to make it a little bit more complicated, but it really is just an act of will. Like some things are just an act of will. And I think that this is one of the biggest things in your business, just to, make sure that you're being successful.
Cool. Well, to wrap things up, do you have any other pieces of advice or words of wisdom you'd like to bestow onto other SaaS founders or founders in general?
If I had to really define it, I think one, making sure you had very, very clear decision makers on who's in charge of what. And along with that, kind of a rules of engagement on, frameworks for thinking through problems. And then the other piece is, and this is something that I unlocked pretty recently by an advisor of ours, is stop focusing on agreement and disagreement and focus more on alignment. And the reason is because most arguments that you're going to have, and we have plenty of arguments with I have an argument with our CPO all the time, those types of things. But most of the time, those arguments are just because we're not aligned on either the goal of something or what the mission is of a particular piece of the product or where we're headed. And I think if you focus more on alignment, it saves you the argument aspect of that. Like you're still going to kind of go back and forth on like what's most important or least important in a particular, direction. But if you focus on alignment, it kind of takes the confrontation out of it. And it's more like, you get to the end of the argument quicker, essentially, where it's like, well, the reason I believe we need to do X is because we should be doing Y. And, the CPO is like, well, I think we should be doing Z. And then you found the kernel of what that argument is, and you can kind of focus on aligning like what the expectations are. So I don't know, those are a few little pieces. And, I'm sure there's a ton of subtext and everything I just said, but I think, overall, that's been a big thing that's really helped us.
Yeah, that's great. At Gecko Board, we're all about that focus and alignment. So totally agree.
Totally. It's like the word of 2017 for us, because I think it's like, if we can align everyone around the mission and we align everyone around the goal, we align everyone on how they fit into the goal, like all that kind of stuff, I think it helps make things a hell of a lot less complicated.
Actually, a follow-on question. I know you said this is one of the challenges you're facing now, but have you come to any solutions to align people around the vision and mission?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit of guess and check, but we've done a few things, and I think we might prune some of these things because it might be overkill. But I think it's easier to prune than it is to like not have enough. And so one of the things that we have is so one, everyone's kind of aligned around one single goal. Like there's a company-wide goal, and then the second part of that goal is making sure that everyone is aware of how their team aligns into that goal. So let's say you have a goal, and ours isn't quite this, but I think it's a little bit easier to understand. Let's say the goal is $10 million. Like that's our revenue goal, right? You go to the product team and you can talk to them about like, okay, in order for us to help with $10 million, we need to make sure we improve the conversion rate of our free to paid product by X, right? And that's a product marketing issue. We're going to come out with this other product and we're going to focus on this, right? So these are the 3 sub goals for product, let's say, or the directions. And then go to sales is a little more obvious, like, hey, you need to hit these numbers, blah, blah, blah. And then we take it even a step further and we have what are called alignment docs. And these are docs that each team member fills out. And what it does is it has a couple of sections. And the most pertinent to what I was just talking about is a slide that connects, so reevaluate, this is what your goals are, individual goals for the greater goal of the company. But also here's how those individual goals are tied to things you want out of your life. So what I mean by that is, we have one of our engineers, he wants a house, he wants, he's about to start a family, all this kind of fun stuff. And so money is a thing for him, right? And so we can very clearly say like, okay, once we hit these milestones, this is what it's going to mean for your individual pay, et cetera. But for other folks who aren't as money concerned at the moment, it might be like they want to be a manager, or they eventually want to be, a surfer or something like that. And we actually connect to, here's how, these different steps connect to your greater goal overall. And I think that's really started to help because it starts to have like a common language amongst the company of like, hey, remember you wanted this thing. Has that changed? If it hasn't, well, I need you to get here so that we can get you to this goal, which is going to feed into the greater goal. And so those are a couple of things that we've done. And I think in that alignment doc, we also have every person fill out like how they like to be communicated with, how they like to receive feedback, all these different things that typically cause tension within a company, so that I can go to that particular person, let's say, and, let's say I have feedback for them. I know that after I check this doc, I can be like, oh, wait, they want this to be in private, even though my natural default is maybe to just turn to them and give them that feedback. And so those types of things help. I think it's one of those things where it might sound a lot more complex than it actually is, but I think it's one doc for each team member, a doc for each team, and then a doc for the entire company. And, everything's pretty accessible through this centralized spreadsheet that we have. And so it definitely helps kind of align everyone.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I really love that, aligning their individual goals with the company goals. Like, sounds like you really take it a step further than most other companies. I feel like a lot just say that.
Yeah. Well, it's about being, and it's not easy, right? Because it can't be like too comprehensive. Like we're 30 people. We don't have like a full-time, like, we have a full-time people ops person, but it's not like we have a full-time like trainer or full-time coach or something like that. But I think it's one of those things where, assuming that your team members are going to be around forever, or assuming that their goal is to build B2B SaaS pricing software, it probably isn't like the best goal. So like, our designer, for instance, like he wants, like, he's really passionate about the healthcare space. And so he wants to work in healthcare, and eventually, but right now he's like trying to level up certain skills in order to like make that launching pad. And so on his alignment doc, we basically have like, head of design at a healthcare startup. And on the left is his current role. And it's like, here are the different skills that we can give you while you're here in order to level up to that point where you're comfortable, going and being the head of design at a healthcare startup or healthcare tech company. And I think it goes back to what I think we originally talked about, like real briefly, which is that two-way street, right? It's a contract between you and the person. And I think oftentimes what ends up happening is it's so like fiefdom, it's so like, top down focused that you forget that these are people, right? And I know that sounds super hippie, and my team's going to be like, I can't believe Patrick just said that. But it's like one of those things where it's so like, it's so important because, if you don't put enough effort into, these people who are, giving part of their lives to you or the mission that you're on, oftentimes like you're going to get not the greatest people to work with. And ultimately you're not going to get to that mission anyways. And so that's something that's really helped us, is making sure that, we come in with the notion of, there are going to be people here who are going to be here for 10 years. But there are also going to be people here who are here for 2-3 years. And that's totally okay. If they're invested in the mission right now, and we can get them to that next place where they want to go into, that next role.
I think that's also just a great place to end this. So thanks so much for the insights.
Yeah, absolutely. Hopefully I gave some new information to some folks rather than just rehashing a bunch of stuff they know.
Thank you for listening to Gecko Board's Secrets for Scaling podcast. Hope to catch you next time.